In the heart of Lancaster, amid rolling hills and the steady hum of the seasons, Samuel Lapp built more than just a farm. He built a life. A life that depended on the hidden art of his root cellar, a simple yet ingenious refuge that kept his family safe through harsh winters and scorching summers. What others saw as a mere hole in the earth, Samuel knew was the key to surviving what nature could throw at them. But it wasn't just the weather that tested his resolve, it was the choices he made to protect what mattered most. Before we begin, share where you're watching from, and if stories of quiet resilience and simple wisdom speak to your heart, join us for tomorrow's tale. Samuel Lapp's hands were calloused from years of labor, but there was something different about the work he was doing now. His shovel bit into the cold earth, as if guided by some unseen force. He had worked the soil every season of his life, but today he wasn't planting or harvesting. Today, he was digging with a purpose deeper than just food. The idea had come to him in the early summer of 1854, after the last frost had finally loosened its grip on Lancaster. He had walked the fields of his farm with his father, who, despite his age, still kept a sharp eye on the land. "The cold of winter," his father had said, "finds a way into every home, even into a sturdy barn or a well-built house. But there's a way, son, to keep what you need safe, to keep what you love from freezing." At first, Samuel hadn't understood what his father meant. But the seed was planted, and as the weather grew warmer, Samuel's mind wandered to the lessons of his forefathers. He had heard stories from his great-grandfather, who had built his home in the old country before emigrating. There, every Amish farm had relied on deep, cool cellars to store what was needed for the coming winter. It was a practice that had been handed down from generation to generation, but Samuel's father had dismissed it as unnecessary for their time. Still, Samuel could not shake the thought that there had to be something more to it. He spoke with men who worked the land, but none could give him the answer he sought. And so he turned to the earth itself, with nothing more than a shovel and his quiet determination. By the time he reached the soil's cool depths, it became clear. The more he dug, the more he felt the earth pressing back, as though guiding him toward an ancient knowledge. His hands worked relentlessly, carving out the cold stone at the bottom of the hill where his barn stood, just far enough away from the house to keep the cool temperatures from invading their home. He could hear the wind stirring the trees above, but below ground, the silence was thick. In the stillness, Samuel knew that he was building something greater than just a hole in the ground. As he reached the final level of the cellar, Samuel stood up, wiping his brow. He couldn't help but marvel at the Frisian Samuel stood up, simplicity and elegance of what he had created. There was no fancy door, no intricate carving, just a sturdy, well-placed structure that would keep what needed to stay cold in the summer and warm during the biting months of winter. But as he set to work on its final touches, placing carefully selected rocks to reinforce the walls and sealing the entrance with heavy wooden planks, Samuel knew he had created a refuge, not just for vegetables and jars of preserved goods, but for his family's survival. And with that knowledge came the weight of responsibility. For Samuel Lapp understood what few could see. It wasn't the structure that would save them, it was how he and his family would protect it. The cold would test them, the snow would threaten to bury them, but the quiet simplicity of their lives would endure, as long as they had faith in what their hands had made. The wind had already begun to howl by the time Samuel and his family gathered inside their small farmhouse, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. But it wasn't the warmth of the flames that Samuel thought about as the storm approached. His eyes kept wandering to the root cellar door, buried under a blanket of fresh snow, safe and secure from the winds that would soon ravage the land. That winter, it was colder than anyone had ever expected. The bitter winds, coming down from the north, froze everything in their path. For days, the temperatures hovered below zero, and the snow continued to fall, deepening the blanket across the fields and covering the land in a white tomb. Samuel could hear the cattle lowing in the barn, but even their shelter wouldn't keep them warm for long. He had seen the signs, the way the cattle huddled in the corner, the way the cold crept through the barn walls. Even the thickest of barns wouldn't keep out the snow when it came in force. But Samuel had prepared. His father had been right, after all. There was a way to outlast the storms, a way to ensure that what was important would not be lost to the cold. That night, as the storm raged outside, Samuel lit a lamp and carried it down to the root cellar. His wife, Sarah, watched quietly from the kitchen as he climbed the few steps leading to the cellar entrance. She had seen him work tirelessly on this project, but it was only now, as the cold crept under their door, that she truly understood its worth. When Samuel opened the heavy wooden door, a warm, earthy air greeted him. The cellar was cool, but not cold, just enough to keep their food fresh. He opened a few jars of pickled vegetables and potatoes, their crispness just as he had hoped. The temperature was perfect. They wouldn't need to worry about food for months. In fact, as Samuel looked around, he realized it wasn't just the food that was safe, they were safe too. As the storm outside raged on, the snow piling higher against the windows, Samuel sat by the cellar, his hands clasped in prayer. The wind rattled the house, but inside, it was still. He felt a deep peace that only came from knowing his family would be protected, no matter how bad the storm became. Samuel didn't know what the future would bring, how many more storms they would endure, or what other tests would come their way. But he had built this cellar with care, with wisdom passed down from generations before him. It was a simple structure, hidden in plain sight, but it would protect them. And in that quiet strength, Samuel knew that sometimes the simplest things were the most powerful. As December gave way to January, the storm showed no sign of abating. The fierce winds twisted and howled around the farmhouse, but Samuel Lapp paid them little mind. His thoughts and his hands were consumed by the tasks at hand. In the weeks since the storm had first hit, the snow had built up with relentless force, turning the fields into an endless sea of white and forcing every settler in Lancaster to confront the unrelenting cold. Inside their small, humble home, warmth was a precious commodity. But what Samuel had known all along, what his father had tried to teach him, was that warmth did not come from the fire alone. It was the simple things, the quiet details, that would keep his family safe. Each evening, after tending to the animals and securing the doors against the wind, Samuel would head down to the root cellar. He found a quiet comfort in the rhythm of the work each visit, each lantern-lit descent into the earth, a promise kept. The cellar had become more than a place to store food, it had become a symbol of survival. The cellar walls, thick with layers of earth and stone, kept the cold at bay, preserving not just the food but the warmth of the family's hearts. Samuel knew that if they could protect this small space, then they could weather any storm. But even the root cellar had limits. As the winter wore on, with each new snowfall, the farm grew quieter, the air colder. The family did what they could, moving closer together in the evenings, sharing stories and songs. Still, Samuel could see the strain beginning to show on his wife, Sarah, and their 3 young children. They were used to the rhythms of hard work, but the winter had worn them down. Food was becoming scarcer outside, and firewood was running low. Yet every time he visited the cellar, Samuel was reassured. The food was preserved, as it had been meant to be. They would survive. One evening, when the storm reached its peak, Samuel took extra care in closing the cellar door. His fingers lingered over the familiar roughness of the wood, the same wood he had handpicked, each plank and nail carefully chosen. He looked back at the house, the light flickering through the windows, and thought about his ancestors. They had faced similar winters, similar struggles, and yet they had endured. Samuel felt the weight of their legacy settle upon him. "I'll make sure we endure too," he murmured to himself. By the time March arrived, Samuel and his family were weary, but they had survived. The storm had taken its toll, but the root cellar, his refuge, had kept its promise. The world outside was still locked in winter's grip, but inside, the family had warmth, both from the fire and from each other. The long winter had tested their endurance, but in their darkest hours, they had found solace in the simple fact that they still had each other and the fruit of their labor. One day, as the sun broke through the gray clouds, casting a soft glow over the snow-covered land, Samuel stepped outside for the first time in weeks, without the fear of the cold biting at his skin. The air still had a chill, but it was different now, lighter, as if spring was somewhere just beyond the horizon. Samuel stood at the door of his home, his hand resting on the doorframe, taking in the rare stillness of the land. He had learned something valuable during those months of isolation and hardship. There was a quiet strength in simplicity, in the knowledge that survival was about much more than weathering the storms. It was about making choices, small and large, that would prepare you for what was to come. His father had known this. His great-grandfather had known this, and now Samuel understood it more fully than ever. The root cellar had not only kept their food fresh, it had kept his family fed, sustained, and safe. Samuel walked to the cellar now with a different sense of reverence. As he opened the door, the familiar scent of preserved vegetables and potatoes greeted him, and for the first time in weeks, he felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. The long winter was behind them, and in the cool, dark space beneath the earth, their future still lay waiting. The sun's rays shone brightly now, and as the thaw began, Samuel's thoughts turned to the coming spring. There would be work to do, fields to plant, animals to tend. But for today, he simply stood there, in the warmth of the light, and breathed. He could hear the faint hum of life stirring outside, birds returning, the soft rustle of wind against the trees. In that moment, Samuel knew that despite everything, despite the doubts of the neighbors, the long months of cold, and the isolation, he had built something that had lasted. And, in the quiet rhythm of the seasons, that something would carry them forward. The cellar, deep in the earth, had been their anchor through the worst of the storm. Now, with spring just around the corner, Samuel stood tall, grateful, and ready for whatever the seasons might bring. As the last of the snow melted and spring slowly crept across Lancaster, Samuel Lapp stood at the edge of his farm, looking out over the land that had once seemed so bleak. The harsh winter had left its marks, cracks in the barns, deep ruts in the paths, and a world that still seemed to shiver beneath the weight of the past season. But for Samuel, there was something different in the air now. It wasn't just the warmth of the sun creeping through the trees, it was the quiet knowledge that they had made it. They had survived, and the root cellar had played a central role in that survival. The neighbors, those who had mocked him for building so slowly, were now beginning to understand. Samuel had overheard whispers of respect in town, murmured by men who once called him foolish for his cautious ways. But Samuel never sought to boast or make a show of it. He simply went about his work. The snow had melted, and now there was a new life to build. One day, William Crawford, the same man who had questioned Samuel's careful construction, came to his farm. Samuel had seen him earlier in the season, digging out his barn from under the snow, but today was different. William's step was lighter, his manner more thoughtful. He approached Samuel quietly as he worked the plow through the soft earth of the fields. "I've been meaning to come by," William said, tipping his hat. "I owe you an apology." Samuel didn't stop his work, but he looked over at William with a raised eyebrow. "I didn't understand back then," William continued, his voice soft, almost regretful. "I thought you were wasting time. Now, seeing what that storm did, I realize I was wrong. You built something that saved more than just food." Samuel stopped the plow and turned to face him fully. He wasn't angry. He had never been one for hard feelings, but he knew the importance of humility in these moments. "It wasn't just about the storm," Samuel replied, his voice steady and calm. "It was about preparing for the things you can't predict. That's what keeps us strong. When you prepare for the worst, you don't end up fighting for your life when the worst happens." William nodded thoughtfully. "I've started rebuilding my barn, taking my time now, and I'm making sure I have enough to get through next winter." "That's all any of us can do," Samuel said with a broad, audacious, small smile. "The key is to keep working, to keep planning, even when you don't know what's coming. If we do that, we'll always have what we need." For the first time in years, Samuel felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. It wasn't from the work itself, nor the fact that his family was warm and safe. It was from knowing that, by simply doing the right thing, by trusting in his hands and the wisdom passed down to him, he had created something that would endure. As the summer months drew closer, more settlers began to visit Samuel's farm, asking him questions about his root cellar, about his methods. He spoke with patience, sharing his knowledge without hesitation. It was never about proving himself right, it was about making sure that the lessons he had learned, through faith and perseverance, would help others. As the seasons passed and the farm flourished, Samuel Lapp began to realize something profound. His legacy wasn't just in the work he had done or the farm he had built, it was in the lessons he had passed on. Every time he showed another farmer how to build a proper root cellar, or shared his thoughts on preparing for winter, he saw a spark in their eyes. It wasn't just gratitude, it was understanding. Samuel had always known that the future wasn't something you waited for, it was something you built, slowly, carefully, just like the root cellar. One autumn, as Samuel prepared for the coming frost, he stood beside the cellar once again, watching the last of the harvest being brought in. His children were growing, learning the same lessons he had learned at their age. His oldest son, Nathaniel, had already shown great interest in the farming methods Samuel had passed down to him, and there were signs that he too would continue the work of the family farm with the same careful determination. As Nathaniel helped his father with the final tasks of preparing the cellar for winter, Samuel felt a great sense of peace. His son had learned the rhythm of the seasons, the importance of hard work and care, and the wisdom of preparing for the worst while hoping for the best. One evening, as the sky above Lancaster darkened and the first cool winds of winter began to stir, Samuel sat by the fire in his small farmhouse, a cup of tea in hand. Nathaniel had gone to bed, and Sarah sat beside him, stitching a quilt by the warm glow of the hearth. Samuel looked out the window toward the root cellar, now covered in a light blanket of snow. He knew the cellar would do its job again. It would keep the food cold in the summer and warm in the winter, and it would protect what mattered most. It wasn't just a place for food, it was a symbol of everything Samuel stood for. It was a place of preparation, of thoughtfulness, of quiet endurance in the face of hardship. He had spent years building it, years preparing for what the future might bring, and now he saw the fruits of that labor. One day, perhaps when he was gone, his children would tell their children about the old root cellar, the one their father had built with care, and they would pass on the lessons it represented, the lessons of faith, of patience, and of the quiet strength it took to face the challenges ahead. Samuel Lapp had never sought fame, he had never asked for recognition, but in the heart of Lancaster, among the rolling hills and windswept fields, his work would live on, through every harvest, every lesson shared, and every life sustained by the simple wisdom of the root cellar. The long dark days of December had come again, and the air was colder than it had been in years. Samuel Lapp stood at the window of his farmhouse, gazing out over the snow-covered fields. The root cellar, now weathered by many seasons, was well hidden beneath a thick blanket of snow. Yet, despite the warmth inside his home, Samuel couldn't help but feel a quiet unease. The storm had arrived earlier than expected, and this winter felt different. His children, older now, had learned the rhythms of farm life, but there was something in the air that made Samuel uneasy. The first real blizzard of the season had arrived 2 weeks ago, and since then it had been one snowstorm after another. Each morning, Samuel had to dig out the barn and the path to the root cellar. Every evening, the winds howled like wolves, and Samuel could hear the howling of the wind against the walls, echoing through the empty spaces of the barn. Sarah, his wife, had a weariness in her eyes as well. She kept the home as warm as she could, but even she had noticed the strain of the unrelenting cold. Firewood, once abundant, was now running low. The cattle were huddled in the barn, and every time Samuel went out to check on them, he felt a tightness in his chest, like the land itself was holding its breath. That was when the first true test of the root cellar came. Samuel had stocked it carefully with jars of vegetables, potatoes, dried meats, and herbs. The earth itself, cool but not freezing, had kept everything perfectly preserved, just as he had planned. But with the increasing cold, something seemed to change. A chill crept even into the cellar, a chill deeper than the wind itself. Samuel could no longer deny the fear that had been creeping into his heart. What if the storm didn't let up? What if the snow kept falling, the wind kept howling, and they could not dig themselves out? What if the food they had preserved in the root cellar would spoil despite all their efforts? With a heavy heart, Samuel gathered his children and his wife around the hearth one evening. The warmth of the fire comforted them, but Samuel could feel the weight of the situation pressing on him. "We may have to dig our way out if this storm doesn't pass," he said, his voice steady despite the fear in his heart. But we'll be ready. We have enough to keep us going, and we'll work together." For the first time in a long while, Samuel's children seemed to sense the gravity of the situation. Nathaniel, now a young man, nodded thoughtfully. "We'll keep the fire stoked, Pa. We'll take turns digging when we need to." The next few days brought more snow and more worry. Yet each time Samuel ventured into the root cellar to check their supplies, he was relieved to find that the food remained fresh. Despite the biting winds above ground, the earth kept the cellar's temperature just right. And every time he closed the door, he knew that his careful planning, his decision to build the root cellar in the first place, had been the right one. But that did not stop the deep worry that lingered in the back of his mind. The storm had tested everything: his faith, his family, his work. Could they survive this winter? Could anyone, no matter how prepared, be ready for something as fierce and unrelenting as this? He didn't have the answers, but for the first time, Samuel realized that sometimes survival wasn't just about the food or the shelter or the preparation. It was about enduring and trusting and doing the work to stay one step ahead no matter how severe the storm might be. Weeks passed, and the snow did not stop. But Samuel Lapp's resolve remained firm. The root cellar, though tested in ways he had never imagined, had remained a place of refuge. While the wind howled outside and the storm seemed endless, the food inside the cellar, canned vegetables, dried meats, and jars of preserves, sustained them. The cellar was as much a metaphor for their survival as it was a tangible structure built with care. The cold would not last forever. This was the one certainty Samuel had held on to during the endless winter. And then, as the days grew shorter and the chill of January began to give way to the first stirrings of February, something changed. The winds began to soften. The biting cold, though still fierce, seemed to lose its grip, little by little. By late March, the earth began to stir, and with it, the promise of renewal. Samuel and Sarah ventured out to inspect the land, finally able to see beyond the snowdrifts that had held them captive for so long. The root cellar had done its job. Every jar was intact, every vegetable perfectly preserved, every piece of food just as it had been stored. But it wasn't the food that Samuel focused on now. The fields were a mess of snow and mud, but Samuel saw the potential. Soon, the earth would warm, and he could begin the work of planting. As he stood there, overlooking his land, he understood something fundamental. No matter how hard the storm, the land always responded to those who worked it with care. Over the next few weeks, the snow melted slowly, revealing patches of green and soft earth. Samuel and Nathaniel worked side by side, planting the seeds they had saved from the previous year. There was still work to be done, but the fear of the long winter had subsided. As the first green shoots began to push up through the earth, Samuel felt a sense of peace settle over him. In those quiet moments, as he sat by the fire with Sarah and the children, Samuel realized that the root cellar, much like the family it protected, had endured. The simple structure, built with patience and care, had become a symbol of something more than just survival. It was a testament to the power of preparation, of trusting in the land, and of understanding that resilience, both human and physical, was built slowly, over time. As the seasons turned and the flowers began to bloom, Samuel felt a profound sense of gratitude. He knew that the storms of life would come again. There would be other winters, other tests of faith. But he also knew that the lessons of the root cellar, the lessons of enduring, would carry him and his family through anything that came their way. And as the sun finally returned to the fields, casting its golden light on the earth below, Samuel smiled quietly. The winter had passed, and with it, the test of time. The cellar had endured. His family had endured. And the future, bright and full of promise, lay ahead. The years passed quietly on Samuel Lapp's farm, the rhythm of the seasons continuing, as always. The winters came and went, but they never felt as harsh as that first test. The root cellar, that humble refuge hidden beneath the earth, had proven its worth time and time again. Samuel had long since stopped worrying about its reliability. It stood as a silent sentinel to the hard work, faith, and patience that had shaped his life. Every year, as the first snows began to fall and the wind howled through the trees, Samuel would visit the root cellar, check the supplies, and rest easy knowing that his family would never want for food. But now, it wasn't just about the food or the survival, it was about the quiet peace that came from knowing that everything had been done with care. Nathaniel had grown into a young man of wisdom, with his father's quiet strength, and had begun taking on more of the work. Samuel watched his son with pride, seeing the same careful nature in him that had once guided Samuel's own hands. They worked side by side, preparing the land, planting the crops, and gathering the harvest together. Sarah had also grown older, but her hands were still nimble, and her heart as steadfast as ever. Together, they had built a life, a strong foundation not just of wood and stone, but of love, faith, and patience. One cool autumn evening, as the harvest was being stored and the cellar was once again filled with the fruits of their labor, Samuel sat down outside his farmhouse, watching the stars twinkle above. His mind wandered to the earlier days, to the storms, the hardships, and the quiet moments when all they had was each other and the promise of another season. The farm was still small, but it had grown steady, just as he had hoped. They had built what they needed: strong walls, deep roots, and a legacy that would carry on for generations. Samuel didn't need anything more. His legacy was not written in the land he farmed or the root cellar he built, but in the hearts of those he loved. His children would carry these lessons forward, just as he had carried them from his father. "Father!" Nathaniel's voice broke the stillness, and Samuel looked up to see his son standing by his side. Nathaniel's eyes were bright, full of promise. "You're quiet tonight," Samuel said, his voice soft but steady. Nathaniel nodded, sitting down next to him. "I've been thinking, Pa. This place, it's more than just a home. It's everything we need, everything we've worked for." Samuel smiled, his heart full. "Aye, it is. But it's not just the house, or the barn, or the cellar. It's the choices we make, son. It's the work we put in. It's the care we take with what we've been given." The wind rustled through the trees, and Samuel sat back, taking in the moment. The seasons would continue, and with them, new challenges would come. But Samuel knew one thing for certain. Whatever the future held, they would face it together, with the same quiet strength and steadfast love that had carried them through every storm. As the years passed, the farm continued to flourish, and the root cellar stood as a testament to the quiet resilience of the Lapp family. Samuel's hands had grown old, and the weight of his years was beginning to show, but his heart was as steady as ever. He had built this life with patience, care, and the knowledge that what mattered most could never be rushed. One late autumn, as the first frost touched the ground, Samuel stood outside, surveying the land he had worked for so long. The fields were quiet now, but Samuel could see the promise of the next spring in every furrow. He had long since passed on the heavier work to Nathaniel, who had grown into a man with his own family, and now his grandchildren played in the fields, their laughter echoing through the air. It was a peaceful time, but Samuel knew that peace was hard-earned. He had watched the world change around him, and though the world outside the farm had moved faster, more hurriedly, he had remained grounded in the simplicity of the life he had built. His faith had remained constant, and his family had grown stronger with each passing year. That winter, as the family gathered for supper, the warmth of the hearth filling the room, Samuel looked around at his children and grandchildren, his heart full. He had lived a simple life, but it had been a life full of meaning. It wasn't just about the food in the cellar, the wood in the barn, or the crops in the field. It was about the love they shared, the faith that guided them, and the strength of family that held them together through every trial. One evening, as they all sat together by the fire, Nathaniel turned to Samuel with a thoughtful expression. "Pa, I've been thinking," he said. "We've done well. The farm is strong, and I want you to know that I'll carry on your work. What you built, what you've taught us, it's more than just a home. It's a legacy." Samuel looked at his son, his heart swelling with pride. He had spent his life building a home, a family, and a future, and now he knew that legacy would continue. "You've learned well, Nathaniel," Samuel said, his voice soft. "But remember this, it's not about the work you do, it's about the care you put into it. It's about living with humility, faith, and love." And so, the seasons passed, and the farm continued to thrive under Nathaniel's steady hands. The root cellar, now a symbol of the family's resilience, still stood as a testament to the quiet strength that had carried them through the years. Samuel's life had not been marked by fame or wealth, but by the simple, steadfast love of his family and the quiet work of building something that would endure. As Samuel grew older, his body grew frail, but his spirit remained as strong as ever. One evening, as he sat by the fire, looking out at the land he had worked for so many years, Samuel felt at peace. His work was done. The legacy he had built was not just in the land, but in the hearts of those he had loved. He had passed on the lessons of faith, patience, and care, and in doing so had built something that would last for generations to come. And so, as the seasons continued to turn, Samuel's legacy lived on, quiet and enduring. Like the root cellar he had built so many years ago, a place of refuge, strength, and warmth that would never be forgotten.